Hey everyone, welcome back to Relish the Journey. I'm very excited for this episode because it's very unfiltered. I guess you could call it raw, just honest conversation between me and Taylor Morley. And Taylor is trans feminine, and we talk all about their journey, how I met Taylor before they were known as Taylor, and this whole process. I watched them share with the world on social media and with our friends from college, and said, you know what, this is a story that we should all actually hear, not just see on a couple of Instagram photos. And they were just gracious enough to come on and answer all my questions. And so I told them that, hey, correct me, because I know I'm going to ask dumb stuff, but I want to ask it with you, and you know it's coming, so that we can educate people to not be so dumb and ask silly things and make people feel uncomfortable, because it's not something you talk about all the time. The more we talk about it, the more comfortable we get with it, the more included people will feel, and that's very important. So open your minds, get ready for a different episode than we've had here before on the podcast, but one that I think is very important for all of us to actually hear and listen to, and then take out into the world this new mindset and these opened minds to make everyone feel included. All right, here's Taylor. And I'm joined tonight by one of my fraternity brothers from college, Ethan Morley, who now goes by a different name. So it's Taylor Morley. Taylor, it's a pleasure to meet you, I guess, right? It's the first time I'm having a conversation with you as Taylor. And I appreciate you coming on the show to share your story with us.
Yeah, so it's funny actually, because I'm going to correct you right off the bat.
Do it.
Because it's Taylor. Taylor actually has always been here because Taylor's my middle name, and it was just a more gender comfortable choice when I decided to transition.
Sure.
So it's not necessarily meeting me now. I really am the same person ostensibly that you knew back in fraternity days. It's just the way I present to the world and kind of my expression of myself has changed, but that doesn't mean my interests and the things that made me me in that time have completely changed now. I'm still, I would say, 80% the same person. It's just how the world sees me is different.
Yeah, it makes total sense. When you put it that way, it does. And this is going to be correction one of many, I'm sure. As we said before we hit record, that I'm expecting you to put me straight, keep me in line, because we're going to talk about a conversation that I've never really had before. And so it's the fact that you are trans feminine, as you've told me. And so so this is a question. Does trans mean transitioning? Is that short for something? Trans?
So trans is short for transgender, which is the appropriate way to refer to it now, which, in basic terms is, across genders. I feel like transgender is a little clunky. To call myself transgender feminine is a mouthful. And I think it's just it's easier to shorten it and just call it trans femme. Trans femme is really the shortest way to say it. You could tie it in and say transitioning is part of that. I guess it's all part of it, but really it's just an easier way to say it that doesn't sound so kind of dated to me.
Got it. Well, I'm curious just to hear from you when this started. And I know you're a certain amount of time into the process of letting the world know that this is you. But for you, is this something that deep down you always knew and sort of fought against? Or is it something you were awakened to?
All right. So correction number 2. So there's really 2 things that are going on with trans. And the first is gender identity and the second is gender expression. I would think you'd have a very difficult time finding or talking to somebody who's trans or non-binary or agender, whatever it may be, who is going to really have an aha moment in their head, but they always knew. Like even if they weren't expressing it, they always had a feeling or they questioned their identity. Now maybe maybe it's not stuff they were aware of right off. Maybe it took 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, whatever it may be. But the concept is, your gender identity is something that usually is something has always been with you. It's not something that's going to change. But where it becomes kind of, I guess, the change that the exterior world looks at is when you choose to conform your gender expression, which is the stuff that you put on your body and how you make your body look to conform with your gender identity. So in my case, I have early memories where I had questions that now are very clearly gender kind of identity discovery things. Specifically, I can remember being maybe 8 or 9 in a museum and being very confused why the tour guide was saying, well, all the boys in this painting are wearing dresses because, little boys wore dresses in that time. And that stuck with me so much. I can paint that picture from memory still. And that's kind of my first questioning moment. So I'm one of the people who can really look back to a young age and say, yeah, there's stuff there that I can pinpoint.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I'm just thinking about what you were saying about the outward expression, right? And so I'm thinking back to college, and to me, you were very outwardly expressed as masculine in college. Like you even posted that one photo on Instagram of you sitting in a chair, and you kind of laughed at yourself, like I finally learned how to sit in a chair, right? But you were masculine. I don't know how else to say it, right? So is that when was it? During college, did you still have those questioning moments? After, like, when was the moment where you just decided, okay, I'm going to go by Taylor?
I mean, so the moment where I decided that I was going to go by Taylor is certainly more recent. Like when I kind of knew what I wanted to do with my life. I mean, even back in college time, like, I have that early memory as a kid. I can really articulate now looking back at high school and even college and, never being comfortable in like that uber masculine setting, even in a fraternity. You'll remember that I was not somebody in the party. I liked a very, more relaxed setting that wasn't so focused on like the traditional ideas of fraternity life, which to me really correlate to traditional ideas of masculinity. But I knew shortly after LICO, that this was something that made sense to me. And I actually started probably in my really early 20s, maybe 22, 23, kind of setting the goal that I was going to decide to transition before 30 because I was too scared if I waited too long that I would miss out on that part of my life.
Got it. So you put this mental finish line, right? And so did you start referring to yourself as Taylor, like in your head before you told somebody else? Or like, what was that moment for you? Like when you just said, I'd like you to call me this now to someone.
So, I mean, it's different. It's a little different for me because, some people, they don't want to stick with, a name that was given to them, or they don't, they aren't. I have the benefit that my parents had the unintentional foresight to give me a middle name that is now, very kind of gender neutral. There's plenty of cis women and plenty of cis men who can go by Taylor. So that kind of gave me a very easy avenue because there's a whole thing with legal barriers and just life barriers that can come up when you don't have identity documents with your name. So for me, Taylor was a way to get to there and avoid those issues. Other people, they pick names that stick out to them, or they pick a name, that just suits them when they decide to transition. But for me, there never was like I'm going to go by Taylor. It was more, well, I like Taylor's convenient situation. Got
it. So now, what does cis mean? You just said cis men, cis women. I've never heard that phrase before.
All right. So I guess sociology 101. So cis man, cis woman is really just the definition of, you were born male, you were born female. So if you're trans or non-binary, you're not really cis because you're not conforming, I guess, with what what at birth you were assigned. So essentially, if you want to get really into lingo, so someone like me who's trans feminine, you could also attach a little acronym AMAB, assigned male at birth, to essentially say, look, my gender identity to me has always been feminine. It's, therefore always been trans feminine, but when I was born, the doctor saw my genitals and they said, oh, you're a male. And that's what I was assigned, even though that's not what I was.
Interesting. Yeah, there's so much lingo. I found that it makes it a little hard to have a conversation about it because I don't know if I'm using the right lingo or if I'm using an offensive phrase or the right phrase. How have you learned the lingo?
So it's definitely interesting because I feel like even with the difference between millennials and Zoomers, that there's new lingo that comes up as people become a little more broad in their definition of what things are. And this is one of the situations where like just community groups on the internet are great to learn it unless you have the time to go take like a gender sociology course or something like that, because at this point, like the spectrum of gender identity, there's a lot of different places you can fall on it. There's a concept, it's like the trans umbrella, where there's a million and one kind of ways that you can describe a gender identity, because again, it's not just man, woman. It's, there's the super hyper masculine man and the super hyper feminine woman. And in between that, there's everyone. And I would really challenge even the most, secure cis woman or cis man, to be able to point out that they're completely at one end of the spectrum and there's not something about their identity that could skew them a little towards the middle than they actually understand.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the phrase tomboy has been around forever, right, for women. So it's not a new idea, right? But the lingo changes, and then the points on the spectrum get further defined, like you said. There's so many different, I guess, places that you could fall. And I imagine that having the correct, quote unquote label that you feel good about accepting is a big deal. So it's not just like you're assigned something again that doesn't quite fit. Would you agree? Is that why you think there's so many variations of what to call things?
Yeah, I would say to a certain extent that's correct. Because really, at the end of the day, it is no one's business what I label myself as. And that goes for, everyone else in the world, if they want to label themselves as a particular gender identity that fits them. Because again, I mean, it's a spectrum. It's not two options. It's a million options, and people need to be able to kind of explore themselves, and find what fits them.
So how far into this specific journey, your trans feminine journey, are you? Like time-wise, I guess, is what I mean by that.
So at this point, I'm still, I guess for myself, there's two ways to look at it. There's that little boy at 8, 9 years old who was questioning. Mm-hmm. There was the high schooler who didn't feel comfortable, like, doing the masculine things. And, and there's like that general progression. So that I would say is all part of my overall journey. In terms of actual, like, this is the day that I decided that I wanted to transition. That's more recent. And that was, there were some complicating life factors that I really would need somebody else in the room because they were part of it for them to help explain. But essentially when I came out very quickly on like social media and to family and friends, because again, I had been thinking about this since I was 8 or 9. So when I was freed up to do it, when I was able to do it, I hit the ground running. So I changed my clothing, my grooming habits, like probably in December. And then by March, I had, kind of made the decision to actually do hormone therapy, which I guess is the quintessential, for lack of a better word, way that a lot of trans people will seek to kind of, get their body to conform to their gender identity. But that in and of itself is kind of a very personal subject. I'm fine really being open about it and talking about it. But the idea to ask like a trans person or a non-binary person or anyone else, on kind of the gender spectrum, what their plans are, what they're doing is something that they should share with you, that you should like pry into from them. Cause what they want you to know is likely going to be what you can see about their appearance. Somebody may not have the life circumstance that lets them express who they are. But for those of us who are able to express ourselves, like I think I would be very confident in saying, like, if you saw me in person, the image I'm trying to portray to you is kind of is enough. Like, so to add details unless they're volunteered is kind of a weird area to talk about.
Sure. Yeah. So that scenario, I'm sure it's happened to you. You're out in the world. Someone sees you. They haven't seen you in a while. You're obviously looking a lot different than maybe the last time they saw you. What's been the worst thing somebody's asked you, or as an example of what not to do out there? Those of us that are new to the idea or don't know people in our lives that are experiencing, this. How do you, I guess, what do you not ask? Like, you started to say that, but I'm curious if you have an example of somebody sees you and they say something that's just really dumb and what that is.
Yeah. I mean, so the one that's the easiest to pinpoint on is like, what's the parts of my anatomy that are covered by my clothes are 100%, out of bounds. Like I really think I've only had one or two people ask me about that. And it's people where they had a curiosity. They weren't really coming from a place of malice, but it's still not something appropriate to ask me unless I volunteer it. And quite frankly, there's very, very few scenarios where I can think I would volunteer that type of stuff. But like in terms of like run of the mill is what, there's two very common situations that I think are very frustrating. One is pronouns. I mean, that's the most basic, especially in the COVID age with a lot of conference calls. Like it's very difficult to keep hearing somebody refer to me as a he, when I stopped using that pronoun, 7 or 8 months ago. And I actually had a situation where somebody was using those. And then in my email signature, I actually have my pronouns to make it easier for everyone. And they saw that and they apologized. But that's not common. Most people will just kind of do it and not realize it, or they'll realize it and they'll remember in the moment, but the next time you talk to them, they're using the same thing. So pronouns are kind of the most common frustration. And then the other one is actually, it's similar, but it's kind of, it doesn't seem like it's kind of harmful, but it really is people who will like invalidate my dysphoria. So the dysphoria is kind of what makes the features about me that make me dislike me. So that's like the masculine stuff I don't want to see in myself anymore. So one right now is like, so I'm trying to train my voice to kind of have more feminine mannerisms, which is why throughout this entire interview, you'll hear my like voice drop, because I can only do it for maybe 6 or 7 sentences before it really strains me and I have to take a breath. But when I tell people that my voice bothers me, pretty much everyone has said, "Oh, but you had such a lovely voice." And it's like, that's not what I'm talking about. Is my regular voice that I use for 28 and a half years makes me feel less feminine than I want to be. And that's why I want to change it. You have a lot of people, it's like, "Oh, I loved your voice," or "Oh, you had a nice voice." It's like, that's not the thing. You're kind of invalidating my dysphoria right now. It's this, you're telling me what makes me unhappy about myself is not something that should make me unhappy. And that's really, really a frustrating thing to deal with.
Yeah, because they're probably just trying to make you feel better, right? Like, oh no, but I liked it, right? And it's like, well, it's not about what you like, right? I don't like it, is what you're saying. And it's having people just understand that. It's kind of like a sympathy versus empathy type conversation, I guess, right? Like it's almost like they're feeling bad for you, right? But you don't need anybody to feel bad for you. There's nothing to feel bad about. Like you're owning it. Like you are in control, and you're making these decisions, and so it's nothing that they need to, I guess, rationalize away.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good way to put it. Is there's I mean historically, gender identity stuff was treated as a mental illness, and not to throw them under the bus, but kind of my own family and some different friends. When you raise this, the initial kind of shock reaction kind of has a little bit of that built in, like, oh, but you never seemed like you were unhappy, or, oh, this doesn't, are you sure? Like, this doesn't seem like you. It's, or again, yeah, it's like your voice was very nice, or, you looked handsome. It's like, I don't want to look handsome. Now tell me I look pretty and we'll have a different conversation, but I don't want to look handsome.
Sure.
I don't want to sound like I have a nice masculine voice. And those are all things that aren't objectively to the average person something that's wrong. But for me, subjectively, it's looking at it as these are all reminders of somebody that I'm trying to change, and somebody who is never me, but biology is biology, and somehow I wound up on the opposite side of where I wanted to be.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that whole process of telling your family, telling your close friends, and what that was like. And so you touched on that a little bit there, but you have to go into all the gory details. But I imagine that was that hard for you? And were people overtly surprised, or did they have any sort of inkling that they saw it coming? When they also had that memory of you at 8 or 9 questioning things, or was it completely out of the blue?
So, for telling people, I had a mostly positive kind of experience. And again, I did it in a very short time frame because I didn't want to drag it out. So I texted a few select friends that I wanted to know, and then I almost immediately started putting it on social media so that I could just be out. Like I didn't want to be like, again, I had planned it for so long in my head, for so many years in my head. Like I wanted the coming out process to just be quick, done, and okay, we're going to move into actually doing it. My family was a little slower because, they're supportive. They support what I'm doing. They still love me, everything. That's, unfortunately, that's not the case for a lot of people who end up having very serious issues with their families not being supportive, which can be a barrier to transitioning, especially when you're younger and rely on family for support in healthcare. But for me, I kind of two-stepped it because I was a little afraid of what my family's reaction was going to be. It turned out to be irrational, but I still had that fear. So, at first I told them I was non-binary, which is, arguably you can be non-binary and trans, you can be non-binary and not trans. Really, non-binary just means you reject the gender dichotomy of male, female, and you try to, kind of express yourself outside of that binary, as the name suggests. So first I told my parents I was that, and then I gave it a couple months. For me, starting hormones was kind of scary enough on its own. And I really didn't want to deal with any family or really anyone knowing at first. So my family, the story for coming out to them about like hormones and actually being like, well, I'm not non-binary. I actually prefer a feminine skew. So that would make me more trans feminine, which is how I explained it to them. Although I kind of knew that calling myself non-binary, was dishonest from the beginning. But so coming out to my family on that front was kind of 4th of July, and it was unintentional. I'd been on hormones. For me, one of the places that hormones has affected first are my breasts, which have actually grown, I guess, arguably quick for me. And I was at 4th of July, and there were some photos taken of the family. And my parents looked at them and were just like, do you need to tell us something? like your shirt's catching your chest a little weird, and it kind of looks like you have breasts. Are you doing like, so that for me is how I truly ended up coming out to my family. It was more of a, yeah, I should probably tell you because the photos are only going to get more interesting from here.
Yeah, that is interesting. I was going to ask you about that. What does hormone therapy do? If that is going to make it so that you don't have to, like you mentioned, your voice, kind of like you're almost putting it on, right? And you can only hold it for so long. Is that going to help it remain in that feminine state? And then I never even thought that it was even possible to, have breasts grow. So that's that's pretty wild. So it's all that and more, I'm guessing, right? And probably an inappropriate question, but here I am asking.
Yeah. So this is another, not a mistake, but a caveat is, again, we talked about it before, that I'm very open about this, and I don't personally have a problem discussing it, but yeah, it would be a very big inappropriate question to ask somebody like, oh, what are you doing on hormones? Like, what do you expect to get out of it? Unless they have bridged the subject. But generally, so hormones aren't going to do anything for your voice. That's all training your muscles, finding what works for you. And I knew voice wise that I didn't want to get super high pitched, that I wanted to keep it lower because it's easier for me to maintain even this voice, and just adding cadence, adding, word choice, just general things to make it kind of have some more feminine trait. But in general, hormones are really their body fat redistribution. So you're talking getting feminine curves, you're talking breast development, skin changes. Like my skin is now, how to describe it, softer, I guess. But other things that don't change that can be very frustrating is like facial hair. It may slow down, but it doesn't stop. I actually have to get like laser hair removal for that. Which in the time of COVID, when you have to wear a mask everywhere and you want to get facial laser hair removal, you can't do that. So that's kind of been a barrier in my transition at this point, is that I haven't been able to get rid of beard shadow. So I just have to get really good at kind of makeup application to hide that. But for some people, hormones can also, cause your hair on your head to kind of regrow if you've lost some or thinned hair. And I think, there's a couple kind of medical concerns with it that probably are not necessarily average podcast listening,
Okay.
that they can do as well. So people can Google that if they want more details for that one.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it just shows how ignorant I am to the whole thing, that I probably will Google it and just learn more, because I had no idea until you mentioned that story about 4th of July.
Mm-hmm.
It's also making me wonder. So I have a son. He's 2.5. Claire and I are expecting baby number 2 at the end of this year, and we found out it's also a boy. And so my mind goes to, as a father, just like that feeling. Like, I don't want to feel like, and I don't know if your parents talked to you about this, and maybe they felt this way. Like, I would feel bad if I missed it. Like, if I didn't see the signs and it was something that my son was like not sure about and questioning and feeling like he didn't have the answers, or that he was assigned something, like you said, right? Because really, as a parent, you just want your child to like just feel like them, you know what I mean? And not feel like they're forced into a box that they don't quite agree with, So this whole conversation, if I'm ever pausing, it's just me processing through that lens as a dad with a young son, thinking about this, because it's something, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, nobody really talked about all this stuff, right? There was maybe that one crazy guy that wore girls' jeans, but he was also in like a rock band, and that was like a fad where guys just wore girls' jeans. It wasn't like a thing where people were doing it because they didn't feel like, that they were assigned the wrong gender, right? Mm-hmm. But now I know that he's going to grow up, and this is just way more of a just like socially accepted thing, right? Like, it's going to be a topic at the dinner table, is this sort of thing. And so it's part of the reason why I was wanted to have this conversation with you when I saw you post on social media and you were open to having the conversation, because I see it as an opportunity to educate myself and ask the dumb questions so I don't ask of somebody I don't know as well as you. Anyway, that was a ramble.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is it's not like trans people like suddenly popped into existence, but it very much is kind of the march of time forward with social progress. But the really key piece of context, even with that thought, is, there's not going to be like an aha moment in a kid's life where a parent's going to be, oh my God, I missed that. Like there'd be a totality of the circumstances type thing where you're just like, all right, it's, they've had this kind of, X amount of behavior that maybe, we should talk about it with them. But yeah, it really, I think just being able to have that conversation and parents being open to talking with their children, hopefully becomes even more common than it is today. I mean, the thing to really keep in mind is up until June of this year, I live in New York, so it's been on the books for a while, but up until June of this year, there were states where you could fire me because I was trans, and that's it. Like, it didn't matter if I was the best employee in the world. Like, there was no federal labor protection for that. Trump is trying to actively change the rules to allow discrimination against trans persons in healthcare. It's not as if all the battles have been won, and it's not an entirely safe world for trans people to live in. Trans people, sorry, and I see I'm ranting in a different direction, but I'm trying to paint the context. Yeah. So trans people disproportionately suffer from rates of homelessness, housing discrimination, employment discrimination, unemployment, violence, homicide, and that's within the LGBT population. So when you look at it as a whole, like trans people, I think generally are starting to be more talked about and more accepted, but it's certainly not as if it's easy for everyone to just kind of live their life, even if the dialogue is starting to get there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that with the pronouns you mentioned in your email, what that was like. I'm assuming, is it a very formal thing where you have to go to HR and say, this is what I'm doing? And like, there's a form to fill out, it seems very like a cold approach to it, but what was that process?
So for me, again, like I'm trying to put a lot of context with my answers, because as I mentioned, like being trans doesn't change everything about me.
Right.
So there's still the person who is the attorney who has the privilege of being an attorney. And that brings a lot of like respect and power just from that title. So for me, as the attorney for my company, I'm actually the one that helps write these rules. I wrote kind of our dress code recently with myself in mind, thinking like, well, what would I want to make sure is protected, so that people are allowed to express themselves in the workplace. So when I decided to come out at work, again, I went the Band-Aid approach, and I got permission to send an all staff email. And I think I did the subject line of reintroducing myself. And I just said, look, like I go by Taylor now. At that point, I'm very comfortable with the idea of calling myself trans feminine, but even 5-6 months ago, there was a little bit of hesitation there. So I think I said, look, I'm trans, if you want to call it trans, you want to call it non-binary, whatever you want to call it. I'm Taylor, like this, that, and that's it. Like, please use they, them pronouns. For me at work, because I work for a nonprofit that really focuses on kind of community building, pretty much everyone there is a very open-minded person, and it was a very positive response. So yeah, I think I had a very easy time to come out of work, where it was literally just an email. And then, I mean, in terms of people accepting and using my preferred name, they had known me for so long, that, you get just a little bit of accidental, like, it's just muscle memory. They're going to use the wrong name. That only lasted a couple weeks before everyone was using the right name. Pronouns are a little harder. I think people kind of rely still too much on physical cues when they're in a conversation. And, that's something I actually still struggle with some coworkers where it's like, I've asked you to use they, them, and you keep using he, his. So
you're saying they, them is what you said?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, the most common pronouns, I think, are obviously he, his, she, hers, and then there's they, them. So they, them kind of covers, people who don't really feel comfortable with the other two, obviously. And for me, I have very strong opinions, on what I want my labels to be. And, pretty much if this was 5 years ago, I think I mentioned, I'd be calling myself a trans woman because that's the common label. And, any trans woman or trans man is a man or a woman, vice versa. So a trans man is a man, a trans woman is a woman. Trans feminine person may still call themselves a woman. It's not that I don't call myself that, but I don't know. There's an ease to using trans feminine at this point because I am only 6 months, on hormones. And even though I started growing out my hair 10 months ago, like my appearance doesn't necessarily cue people in that I'm trans feminine. I don't need to, I don't feel like I need to do that right now. So I kind of wanted a label that avoided the awkward conversation and explanation, of calling myself like she, her right now. So they, them is just something that's like, I think for most people, hopefully they learn to understand like that just means, they just, I don't know. To me, it's just use them.
Sure.
That pronouns for me are really difficult to talk about.
Well, it's because you did it in a staged approach with your family, and it's probably just another staged approach, right? As eventually you might choose one or the other, but for now, this is what feels good, and so that's what you're rolling with.
Yeah, I mean, if I could critique my own transition in one way, it's that I'm too controlling of the timing. And I'm too controlling of not letting myself have bad situations with it. So really at the end of the day, I think that's, honestly, that's what kind of stopped me from using a she, her pronoun at this point, is because I just want to avoid having to explain myself every time I talk with somebody. And they, them kind of allows that.
That makes sense. So what do you see? I forget the exact phrase you used, but it was almost like what you wanted to do with your life, you said earlier in our conversation. So does that tie into what this whole conversation we're talking about? Do you see yourself as becoming more of an advocate on this topic and to help bring awareness to everything and to help other people that are, not as comfortable with it as you are?
Yeah, I would love to see myself become an advocate. It's kind of there's different ways to go about it. And I had a conversation with a coworker who oversees our kind of early childhood education things. And I was very frustrated because I felt like I wasn't being able to use my position at work to be a forceful advocate that I wanted to be. And what actually came out of that conversation was great for me because it was an understanding that, I think that for the average person, if you ask them, do they know a trans person and not just say like a famous person they know from TV, but like, do you actually know somebody? And they'd probably say no. So there's an advocacy and being visible. So we had a couple, trans children in our education programs. And unfortunately, one of them ended up getting bullied and decided to kind of stop expressing themselves because of that. And, for me, I just want to be that person in the elevator or that person walking down the hallway where they can see somebody like them, who is kind of in a position of power, and is confident with who they are and is proud of who they are. And they just kind of be advocacy through role model. Ideally, I think I'd love to have a soapbox, and be a more forceful advocate, but I definitely think that there's just advocacy by visibility, really is a huge way to just show people that I exist, people like me exist, and we can be attorneys, we can be people in power, and that, if that makes me a role model to maybe one person in my lifetime, then that's a win.
Yeah, just show somebody that it's possible, right? Like, yeah, these kids are just horrible at any age, no matter what you're going through, right? But kids might bully you, but look, here's what I've able to do, and I'm like you, and just so that they see that and not feel like they're the only person out there. So I imagine it's very lonely, especially when you're a kid, like you said, at the museum, right? You felt confused, and there was no one that could really say, no, it's okay. Look, I'm over here, so you can be that person.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was zero trend. I mean, I went to a very rural high school, middle school, so there was zero. I mean, I struggle even at this point, and I'm sure there was, and no insult to anyone at Lycoming, but I struggle to even think of, like openly trans, feminine or trans women at Lycoming that were really out. I mean, of course, that could just be my own blindness at that point, but yeah, for me, it took me a very long time from that little boy in the museum to getting to my early 20s where I kind of knew where I wanted to go. And I think that would have gone a lot quicker if I had either a role model or just exposure. Unfortunately, myself in middle school and high school, I did have a lot of instances of bullying, specifically kind of being taunted and being called gay. And, you look back at something like that now and you're just like, that's maybe they were in the ballpark and it was never okay for them to do it, but maybe they were in the ballpark. But like, to what extent did that experience make myself uncomfortable with myself and not explore it? But ultimately, I try not to think about those, because everything in my life that has led up to now has made me the person I am. And the person I am is the one who's able to do what I'm doing at my own pace, and with a certain confidence that I don't think I would have had earlier in my life.
Sure. That's an awesome outlook to have. Absolutely. So that brings me to a question I like to ask everybody. Since the show's called Relish the Journey, and we've been talking about elements of your journey, how would you describe all of this, your journey, in 3 words?
Ooh, 3 coherent words?
3 English words. They don't have to be a phrase. They can be individual ones, but just okay.
3. So definitely anxiety, understanding, and pride. Just being proud of my identity and realizing that it can be an asset and not something to use as something that's holding me back.
Sure. It's an interesting progression there, right? Like, before you acknowledge the identity, like you said, I'm sure there was a lot of anxiety, sort of kind of fighting against yourself. Then you move to understanding and figuring out what exactly it is, and now you're proud of it. So it's a neat progression of the 3 words.
That was 100% unintentional, but
there you go. Subconsciously, you did it. What I think is neat about this whole conversation is, well, it's awesome that you're proud of it and you're owning it. But, I don't know how to phrase this properly, but it's like you do get to create that identity. Like, you're proud of this identity, and from the way your voice sounds to the name that you chose to go by, whether it was your middle name or not, the pronouns, like, you're making the conscious decisions to say, here's who I am. And whether it's somebody who is trans or anything that's on, that spectrum of A and B, right, and all those things in the middle we said, a lot of people, regardless of what they're going through, don't make that decision, right? They just kind of let the world heap things on them, and things are assigned to them, like you've talked about, and then that just becomes them. they don't stop to decide this is who I want to be. And so I think that's a really cool part about what we've spoken on in this podcast is that you're taking control of your life and you're deciding that this is me and you're proud of it. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very much, it's going from living my life in kind of grayscale to living in Technicolor. So it's not that I wasn't living a life, but it was like a life of, okay, I guess I'm content, as opposed to like now it's like, I like my life. My life makes me happy. That is the one thing I think, that's the comment that I appreciate and I get the most at this point is people who have known me and they've spent time with me now and they had spent time with me in the past and they're just, you seem happier.
Sure. You totally seem happier. I mean, you were kind of a curmudgeon in college. And some of that, I mean, you still have the wit, and the sarcasm a little bit and just that, strong personality, that's still there. Like you said, it's still you. You've always been you, but I can definitely tell that you are happier and confident just from this phone conversation that we're having right now.
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, it's again, it's like going from grayscale to Technicolor. It's very much, it's such a different feeling, to be comfortable in where my body is going, and be comfortable with how I present to the world. I mean, it's not to say that there's not still anxiety, like bathrooms, traveling and using bathrooms, after I get out of the New York City area is still a heart pounding, harrowing experience in my mind. But
yeah, I didn't think about that. That was in the news for a while, a couple of years ago too. So that's.
Oh no, that's still, I mean, just let me pee where I want to pee. Like that's, yeah, I can attest for almost 99.9% of anyone in a bathroom, regardless of gender identity, just wants to use the fucking bathroom. So let trans people use the bathroom. That doesn't make me need a fucking Xanax before I go in.
Right. There you go. That's our PSA right there. Just let me pee. But I imagine that's got to be because you just don't know the type of people you're going to encounter based on where you're at in the country, and that's, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it's like I will try to avoid it at all costs because what are my choices? My choice is the fear and anxiety that if I use the women's restroom and I don't present as feminine enough, that someone's going to scream and chase me out of there, and depending on where it is, maybe the cops get called. The other is, great, I've gone into the men's room wearing heels and a fucking contour on my face, and I'm wearing a bright floral blouse, and I'm going to get looks and I may get some ill comments there, but hopefully the cops don't get called on me there. It's like, that's kind of the insecurity I think that goes along with that now. It's just like, it's kind of become this flashpoint, and that legal case, that's still being decided. There's not a definitive answer there. And even once there is, legal precedent is fine and dandy, but that doesn't stop somebody from acting out. And there's very few things that scare me. And to be honest, using a bathroom while traveling is one of the things that scares me at this point. It's just not that feeling of kind of being like, you're going to get a look. It's just whether is that look going to escalate or is it not? But right. even with all that, like I could travel at this point and still just do like a V-neck t-shirt and Keds or something and no makeup, but I refuse to do that. Even though it scares the shit out of me to have that experience, I refuse to change how I look so that somebody else doesn't get upset by me. So it kind of is what it is, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about what you said about living in gray and then going to Technicolor. It's that non-binary conversation, right? So many people think the world is just black and white. You're one thing or another, but this conversation is just, there's a whole lot of colors out there beyond black and white, right? That don't make them wrong. People need to pee, right? Like you said, just let me effing pee. That's wild. So many things that I just take for granted because I don't have to think about that, right? But that's something you think about often. I can tell by the way your voice changed there.
Yeah, even my most recent traveling, it's one of those, like for me, I find a certain empowerment when I'm on the sidewalk in something that is kind of androgynous but still feminine. And people really need to stop doing like the head turn and kind of that stare, because guess what? We notice it a lot more than you think. Especially the couple who did it when I was getting out of my car this afternoon, and it was like she looked, he looked, she mouthed, don't look, and I'm just like, fuck you, you're not you're not being subtle. But that stuff I find a bit of empowerment in it, because it's like, all right, if you had to look twice to confirm what you were thinking, at least that means I'm on the right trail. And hopefully there's a time in my life where there isn't a second look. But yeah, that's like, there are still some very scary situations. I've been lucky enough not to really have those again, because I am coming from a place that already is very, again, just privileged, like in terms of I work in a place with gender neutral bathrooms. I'm part of senior staff there. So like, even if there weren't, I could dictate policies. I live in an area that's a little more progressive, and not everyone has those, but it still kind of scares me, like something that basic, where you're kind of in that, lack of a better word, you're in that exposed situation. And you just can't control what other people are going to think and say.
Right. Yeah. So it's been about an hour. I want to move just to wrap up our conversation. And I'm curious, as we try to tie a bow on this, it's hard to tie a bow on because so many different pathways we went down, and it's a complex topic. But what do you want the world to know about you, about all of this, that if people listening to this, they're still listening, they made it this far, you want them to take away one thing from this conversation? What would that thing be?
Yeah. So I guess like if there could be one, you wrap it up in a simple bow, is just, I might be inappropriate, fuck off. Like, let people, like, why should it bother you if I express myself how I want to express myself? Like all of these different conversations that need to happen regarding treating, trans people and non-binary people as essentially as they want to be treated and perceived how they want to be. Like, it hurts no one. So why comment on it if you don't have something positive to comment, and why fight it? So just kind of fuck off and let us live our lives.
There's that curmudgeon that I met. No, I think that's so true, right? It's like you said, right? And I appreciate you being a good sport with some of my just curious questions, because I'm new to the topic, but you probably could have said that to me a few times about my topic, right? It's just, people don't need to know all the reasons why or what's going on. It's just, it's not my life. It's not anybody else's life. It's yours. And so let you live it. And like you said, you're the happiest you've been in a long time, and that's what should matter.
Exactly. Like, if you know somebody who's questioning or someone who's totally out there, if they're happy, like, be an ally to them. Try to be supportive. Be appropriate about how you ask questions with it, but just be supportive. And if you can't be supportive, then you really need to kind of look at the reasons why you have any sort of bias or prejudice against, gender variance, which is another, terminology word we can throw out there. Gender variance is anyone who isn't strictly to the stereotypical binary. There's no reason for it. Just, be supportive, be an ally, or get out of the way.
Perfect. So people listen to this, they like what you had to say. They want to get to know you better. They want to follow along your journey. They're curious to put a face to the name. Where should we send them? You want us to link up to your Instagram profile, or you want to send them to resources that have helped you? Where should people go to take action after this episode?
Yeah, I don't view myself with enough self-worth to say, hey, come look at my Instagram. Although if you can find it and You want to give me fake internet points on my selfies? Fantastic. But really, there's a lot of ways that you can be an ally, and whether that's, financial donations to any one of the many nonprofits that help, and it's not even just trans, but help LGBT kind of youth and adults kind of figure out their lives and be able to kind of move their own journeys forward. But I also just encourage people, like, this is not this, I think, as you said, this is a very complex subject. And it's not something that a single hour of conversation can really even get to all the complexities. So it's just, read on it, like read other people's experiences and just kind of try to, if there are questions, if people hopefully start questioning their misconceptions about it, to just educate yourselves. And if you're driven to actually become an active ally, again, there is 101 nonprofits that can use financial or volunteer support or any other thousands of ways that they can be supported.
All right. Awesome. Well, those are my questions. Is there anything else you want to say, or is this an okay spot to end it for you?
I think it's an okay spot.
All right. Well, hey, I appreciate your candidness, your willingness to come on and talk about all of this. Like I said before, I'm putting up with some of my dumb questions. And yeah, just thank you. I appreciate you sharing your journey with me and with all the listeners of the podcast.
No, and I think the visibility is the best way to be an advocate. So I want to thank you for letting me talk about myself for an hour. There's nothing somebody likes more than talking about themselves. So
that is true. I've learned that in podcasting. Everybody loves talking about themselves.
Thanks again for having me on, and it was great.
All right, that's a wrap for this episode of Relish the Journey. Thank you all so much for listening. And thanks to Taylor for sharing their story, because we all need to listen to each other and actually hear stories from different opinions, people going through different things. That's how you can actually relish the journey. And relish your journey is by appreciating the journeys that other people are on. So thank you, Taylor, for sharing your story. Until next time, everybody, cheers.